Welcome back to the episode of Alternative Space History. I am your host, So Not the Hero Type, and we're going to dive right in with a throwback to an OSIRIS-1 launch vehicle carrying the Pathfinder 1 probe. I will be showing what the Pathfinder probe is here shortly because I do have a little build video after the fact, but I just wanted to start off the video with a launch. Now, we're using the OSIRIS-1 purely for cost effectiveness, and I haven't used one in quite some time. The reason for this probe is because I had another probe in orbit that I was using to try to plot interplanetary windows, and unfortunately it wasn't in the correct orbit, so none of the windows that I had plotted out are actually viable, which is unfortunate because I supposedly had a Mars transfer window that is no longer available. And our next window is Venus, which is actually at the very beginning of 1961. Unfortunately, because these are very outdated engines, we had a major failure on one of the SD3 side boosters, and it kind of sent the rocket going spiraling out of control, so we unfortunately had to blow it up. I do go ahead and redo this launch, but I update the engines to the more modern engines that the OSIRIS-2 is using purely for reliability, and the Delta V I have is still plenty to get this little probe into orbit. Now back over to the VAB, we're going to actually show the construction of the Pathfinder 1 and UCB mounting the OSIRIS-1 onto it. I didn't bother to include the footage where I updated the engines because it was just kind of a blink of an eye type situation, so we just avoided that entirely. In fact, the whole Pathfinder launch, the second attempt at the launch, everything goes according to plan. Like, nothing goes remotely wrong, and we're not going to really talk about this launch. I'm going to take this time to talk about the fact that I'm definitely going to steal Carnasa's idea and split up my years. That's mostly because I don't want to have to cut out so much footage like I have been, because these years are going to start having a lot more involved with them. We're going to be splitting a lot of them up between interplanetary stuff as well as lunar contracts, more manned missions. We're going to be pushing a bunch of tech. I plan to be very busy for the next 2 or 3 years, so it'd probably be easier just to cut the episodes in half. That way my sanity's intact and you guys don't have to listen to me talk for 45 minutes. And more than likely, we're going to start doing bi-weekly episodes of Alternative Space History, and on the off weeks, we'll be doing my Beyond Home series, Life After Kerman. Might as well promote my own stuff while I'm talking to you guys. Anyways, as I said before, this launch went flawlessly. Everything went according to plan. As of right now, the Pathfinder 1 is just coasting its way into orbit, using that central core stage with the LR-105. But we're going to pop back over to the VAB and do some quick adjustments to one of the Manny 3 probes that we've used a few times in the past. These particular launches are just solar orbit launches, more or less just to test the antenna capabilities as well as sustainability of the deep space probes. Once I will have one more Manny launch, which will actually more than likely be doing a Venus encounter, and after that we'll be unlocking some more tech that I have researching, and I will continue with the Pathfinder missions, which will be, the Pathfinder program itself will be all about interplanetary probes, orbiters, scanning tech, stuff like that. Unfortunately, because of the time it takes to research everything I need, we won't see any of that until the next few years. And now coming back to Vandenberg, we have Carnasa Kerman, a returning guest star, doing our second crewed orbital flight contract in the Outreach 2. The Outreach program was early human spaceflight, as well as tests for sustainability and how to not kill our astronauts while they're in the vacuum of space. Not only will he be pushing to complete a contract that I had picked up for some extra funding because we need to build up a bunch of funds since I'm going to be buying a lot of new tech soon, it's also to test out how long we can keep them into space without killing them. I'm hoping with a few more deep space probes we can get the science points required to unlock the next generation capsules, which we need about 100 science to complete. That way we can start doing more advanced manned missions, as well as more parking orbit and man-to-man rendezvous. Other than that, though, this flight actually went off without a hitch. We spent a lot of time doing some research on the outreach rockets. I wanted to make these as safe as possible. They're full of redundancies, way more supplies than they actually need, as well as 2 different orbital maneuvering stages. The main AJ-10 stage is for the basic maneuvering. It's to adjust the orbits and stuff, but because there's only 3 ignitions, I also have that little RCS engine set up on a small tank to give them a little more delta V, just in case they end up in a situation to where they can't deorbit themselves. They will be able to get back down. We're still having a slight issue with some of the batteries exploding on re-entry, but all in all, Carnasa came back safely and no one got hurt. He experienced some high G forces, but he did not pass out, and everything went according to plan. We will be having 1 more outreach launch this year. That way our 3 main astronauts have a chance to visit space. Unfortunately, Ziggy Kerman retired very early this year, so we are down to 3 astronauts. I will be hiring more in the near future once we unlock more advanced capsules, so we can start kind of getting them trained up and getting them to do more launches. But as you see there, I just picked up the first rendezvous contract, and we're going to be launching something called the Rend-1, which is basically a rendezvous target. I didn't bother to include a build video because I literally just took a Sputnik probe, slapped a battery on it, and threw it on an OSIRIS-1. It really wasn't worth recording. This OSIRIS-1 is also using the advanced engines, and we're just going to put this in an orbit I know I can recreate fairly easy. As we're launching these from Vandenberg, we're going to be doing a polar orbit, and a little bit later we're going to be doing a manned mission to try to rendezvous with this little probe. It will not be the next manned mission because I had 1 more orbital contract I wanted to wrap up and I couldn't combine the 2, but our plans were originally to rendezvous with that and our 4th manned flight, which we ended up canceling due to other reasons we'll touch on later. And we go back to the VAB once again to start working on the Analyse project probe, or the Analyse 1 in this case, which is going to be a series of probes that will be doing scan-sat contracts. Starting with Earth, doing a low resolution one, and future missions including the Moon, hopefully Mars, and possibly Venus as well. Analyse is essentially just scan in French, which is a little tribute to my wife, who is an amazing French speaker, if you ask me. But these probes will become more advanced later on down the road. For now, we just needed a real basic one to do a low Earth orbit scan. We gave it a little RTG to keep it sustained power-wise, enough electric charge to keep it alive, and once again using the OSIRIS-1 to launch it into a polar orbit so it can get a nice low-res scan of Earth in its entirety, thus completing the contract as well as giving us a beautiful detailed map of the planet we call home. We did give it some RCS thrusters and a little bit of propellant just to adjust itself in the situation we needed to. Fortunately enough though, because of the way the scat sand works, we probably won't need to use it. But nonetheless, we went ahead and got this tooled, built, and ready to be launched for the very first time at Vandenberg Air Force Base, as it's easier to get the polar inclination orbit as well. We did also make some minor adjustments to the way these engines are set up on the OSIRIS-1, more for aesthetical purposes. And of course we did upgrade these to the newer engines as well for a reliability standpoint. We're going to phase back over to the Space Center because we just spent a bunch of money on new upgrades for the VAB and R&D building because they were very, very much needed, as well as I'm trying to get the R&D tech done as soon as I possibly can. I'm hoping once we get into 1961, we'll have all the tech needed to do proper interplanetary missions, as well as land a probe on the surface of the moon. But here we have our next launch, which is going to be the Altered Manny 3 probe, which is going to be another deep space test probe to see how well we can keep in contact with our probes in deep space and in solar orbit. This particular probe is going to be launched as close as we can to a Mars orbital line. Like, we're not going to be in a complete Mars orbit, but we'll be passing the orbital line of Mars itself. And again, it's just to kind of test out the communication ranges that these new antennas we have are capable of. I did want to wait until we got the more advanced avionics for deep space for power purposes and weight purposes before doing full-scale probe missions to another planet. Surprisingly enough, this launch went off without a hitch. We are overburning those 4 side boosters by a few seconds because of the amount of data we have on them. I feel comfortable doing it. We have had some thrust lost here and there on occasion, but for the most part, the OSIRIS 2 has become a very good rocket for our program and has definitely made the money back that we put into it. But after getting into a nice stable low Earth parking orbit, we decided to go ahead and ignite those twin AJ-10 stages to go ahead and push us into a deep space orbit, crossing the orbital line of the red planet Mars. We did have to use a little bit of the onboard RCS thrusters to complete it, as not only were we at a non-optimal burn at time, we also just kind of ran out of fuel towards the end of it, and I cut the engines off a little earlier than I was planning on. But we've officially released the probe as it floats off into the blackness of deep space. But with that, we're going to phase over to the 5th launch, the Analyse 1, being shot into a polar orbit to get a low-res scan of Earth. This, again, using the OSIRIS 1 base purely for cost reasons, flew perfectly fine. This rocket has enough delta V for the small payload. It can easily do a decent polar low-Earth orbit. And now we just have to let the ScanSat technology do its job as it makes this beautiful low-res scan of the planet we call home. After warping through a few hours to get this contract complete, we do pop back over to the VAB and finalize the contract. But we were completely successful, and the probe was actually able to stay alive longer than expected, as well as collect us a little bit of scientific data in the process. And once again, back to Vandenberg, we are going to be doing our 7th and final launch with Oliver Kerman at the helm, flying the Outreach 3, not only completing another orbital manned mission contract, also being Oliver's first time orbiting Earth. Now, for some reason, we got the Rendezvous contract finished as well, and I believe it's because of the avionics on that base core when we separated them, which is kind of depressing. So we still may end up doing a orbital rendezvous anyways, just to do it, even though the contract is no longer a viable contract. Again, with the tested reliability of the Outreach rocket, everything went according to plan, and there was no severe issues during the launch. Booster separation was nice and clean, as it has been before, and Oliver Kerman was fast approaching his first manned orbital mission around Earth. After reaching a stable orbit and staying up there for a minimum of 18 hours as the contract wanted us to do, Oliver Kerman successfully did every part of the mission that was required of him and had plenty of resources and fuel left. Before returning to Earth, Oliver Kerman realized the amount of fuel he had left and requested to aim for a higher orbit around the planet Earth, which was granted, initially set to push him just over 500 kilometers above the surface, thus breaking a record as well as setting a new milestone for all mankind. After they realized he had enough fuel to go even farther with an ignition left, as well as having the fuel to return back home, Oliver Kerman requested to go 1 million kilometers above the surface, and it was granted. After the third and final successful ignition of the AJ-10 stage, Oliver Kerman had reached a projected path of 1,054 kilometers above the surface, where he floated up to break a few records, not only for the space agency, but for all mankind. Once he reached the top of his orbit, which was slightly eccentric as his AP was roughly the 1 million and his periaps was still floating around 160 kilometers, he released the bottom stage, activated his RCS maneuvering thruster, and the 2 SRBs that we had attached prior to perform a retrograde burn and put himself on a projected path back to the waters of Earth. After a little bit of adjustment with the RCS thrusters, Oliver Kerman prepped himself for re-entry. After a few little adjustment burns, we had a nice projected path to hit the waters of Earth as he came back into the atmosphere and bled off tons of speed. His mission was successful, and he was able to land without any issues, thus completing Oliver Kerman's not only first orbital mission, as well as breaking several milestones in the process. Due to the fact that the orbital rendezvous contract was complete, we decided to hold off on the final launch or the final manned mission of the year and go ahead and call it an episode. We do have a Venus transfer window coming up, so we are going to be attempting that at the very beginning of 1961. But at that point, I'm going to go ahead and call this an episode. So I want to thank you guys again for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed the content. Again, we are going to be doing these every other week, as well as possibly splitting up the years. I'm like 99% sure I'm going to. And as always, I will be leaving a link to Carnasa's Discord in the description. It's a great place to come meet new KSP players, as well as get help on situations you may be struggling with. I'll also be linking my Beyond Home series in there as well, which will be filling in the bye weeks from Alternative Space History. So I hope you guys see that and enjoy that as well. And I hope I see you guys in the next year, the year 1961.